The music was already too loud when Daniel Mercer arrived. Bass from a portable speaker thumped unevenly across Alder Ridge Drive, vibrating through the soles of his shoes as he stepped off the curb. Paper lanterns swayed between two maple trees, their warm glow fighting against the slow fall of the early evening. Someone nearby was overcooking burgers. The smell of charred meat hung thick in the humid air. It looked like the kind of neighborhood gathering people posted about online. Easy smiles, folding chairs, kids running barefoot across trimmed lawns. Daniel adjusted the cuff of his button-down shirt and forced his shoulders to relax. 3 weeks. He had lived here exactly 3 weeks. Long enough for people to recognize his face, not long enough for them to stop measuring him. A group of men near the grill burst into laughter. One of them glanced at Daniel for half a second before quickly looking back at the burgers. Yeah, the movement was small, but Daniel felt it the way you feel a draft in a closed room. He told himself not to overthink it. He had promised himself that when he moved here. Fresh start. Normal neighborhood, normal life. Lila Park appeared beside him so smoothly he did not hear her approach. She carried a bright plastic pitcher of lemonade in the kind of polished friendliness that made other people instantly relax. Her smile was wide, carefully practiced. Daniel, right. I'm so glad you made it. Her tone was warm enough to pass for genuine. She handed him a plastic cup without waiting for an answer and filled it halfway with lemonade. The ice cubes clinked sharply against the sides. He nodded once. Thanks. Appreciate the invite. Up close, he could smell her perfume, something light and expensive. It mixed oddly with the smoke from the grill drifting across the yard. Lila studied him for a moment. Not openly, just long enough to feel deliberate. Then she reached out and gave his arm a quick squeeze, like they were already familiar. You know what, Daniel? You fit right in. The sentence landed gently, too gently. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the cup. Cold condensation gathered instantly against his palm, but the lemonade itself was already losing its chill in the heavy evening heat. Around them, 2 neighbors standing near the snack table nodded in quiet agreement. One of them let out a short laugh. Yeah, seriously. Wouldn't even guess you just moved here. Wouldn't even guess. Daniel smiled. The same controlled smile he'd been using for years. Glad to hear it. His voice came out steady, easy. Like nothing inside him had shifted. But something had. Because people usually only said you fit right in when they had expected you not to. A kid ran past, nearly colliding with Daniel's leg before being called back sharply by a parent. The boy muttered a quick sorry without making eye contact and kept moving. Small thing, normal thing. Still, Daniel felt that familiar tightness settle just under his ribs. Lila was still watching him. Well, everyone's been curious about the new neighbor. Her tone was light, but the word curious lingered in the air a little too long. Daniel took a slow sip of the lemonade. Too sweet. Slightly metallic from the cheap cup. He swallowed anyway. Hope I'm not too disappointing. It was meant as a joke. Lila laughed on cue. Oh, please, you're doing great. Everyone likes you already. Everyone likes you already. That one pressed a little deeper, because Daniel had spent most of his adult life learning exactly how much that sentence was worth. Across the yard, the music suddenly cut out with a harsh electronic pop. For half a second, the entire block party fell into an awkward silence. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Someone cursed near the speaker. Then the music roared back to life, louder than before. The moment passed, but the strange feeling in Daniel's chest did not. Lila's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down quickly, then looked back up with an apologetic smile already forming. Duty calls. But seriously, Daniel, we're really glad you're here. Her hand brushed his arm once more before she turned and disappeared into the crowd, already calling someone's name across the lawn. And just like that, the warmth around Daniel cooled. He stood alone beside the folding table, plastic cup damp in his hand. Laughter rose again from the grill. Two women near the sidewalk lowered their voices as he looked their way. Maybe coincidence. Maybe not. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. He had promised himself he would not do this again. Not the second guessing. Not the quiet scanning of every room. But old habits did not disappear just because the zip code changed. The lemonade had gone completely warm now. He set the cup down carefully on the edge of the table. Maybe he needed something colder. Something stronger. Inside the house, through the open patio doors, he could see the large blue coolers lined up along the kitchen island. For a moment, he hesitated. Outside, the party carried on like nothing was wrong. Like nothing was ever wrong. Daniel straightened his shoulders. Then he turned and walked toward the house. Behind him, the laughter rose just a little too late. The kitchen was colder than it should have been. Air conditioning hummed steadily from somewhere overhead, pushing out a sharp, artificial chill that clashed with the warm summer noise drifting in from the backyard. The sudden drop in temperature made the back of Daniel Mercer's neck tighten as he stepped fully inside. For a moment, the room was empty. No laughter, no polite smiles. Just the low mechanical buzz of the fridge and the slow tick of a ceiling fan that sounded slightly off balance. Daniel exhaled quietly. He did not realize how tense his shoulders had been until they dropped half an inch. The kitchen island was crowded with party leftovers. Half-melted ice buckets, plastic bowls of chips already going stale, a stack of paper plates curling slightly at the edges from the humidity. Normal. Everything looked normal. That helped. He moved toward the large blue cooler positioned beside the sink. Water pooled faintly around its base where the ice inside had begun to melt. When he lifted the lid, it gave a soft, rubbery squeak. Cold air rolled out. Rows of bottled beer floated in cloudy ice water. Daniel reached in slowly. His fingers brushed the freezing surface and held there for a second longer than necessary. The cold grounded him in a way the crowded yard outside had not. He wrapped his hand around the neck of one bottle. Behind him, footsteps approached down the hallway. Daniel did not turn right away, not frozen, just listening. Two voices drifted into the kitchen before the women did. Lila's voice came first, light but lowered now. "I'm just saying it caught me off guard." Another woman answered, softer, cautious. "Well, he seems perfectly polite." Daniel's grip on the bottle tightened slightly. A thin crack sounded from the shifting ice inside the cooler. Neither woman noticed. Lila let out a small breath that almost sounded amused. Polite doesn't tell you much. The words were quiet. Careful. Daniel kept his back to the hallway, eyes resting on the floating bottles like he was still deciding which one to take. The second woman spoke again. "You think something's off." A brief pause followed, long enough to feel deliberate. Then Lila's voice dropped another notch. "I don't know, maybe. Did you notice the return address on that package earlier?" Daniel's chest went very still. Water dripped slowly from the bottle onto his wrist. The second woman shifted. "No, what about it?" Another pause, shorter this time. That area he lived in before this place. It's not exactly quiet over there, not exactly quiet. The phrase slid through the air and settled heavy. Daniel stared into the cooler. The ice bobbed gently against the glass bottles. Inside his chest, something old stirred. Not sudden anger, not shock. Recognition. Because he had heard versions of this before. Different neighborhoods. Different voices. Same careful distance hiding under polite smiles. The second woman spoke again, more hesitant now. "People move. Doesn't mean anything." Lila made a soft, non-committal sound. "Maybe. I just think we should keep an eye out, that's all. Keep an eye out." The ceiling fan clicked overhead. Once. Twice. Daniel slowly straightened. He lifted the beer from the cooler, water streaming down over his knuckles, and finally turned toward the hallway just as Lila and the other woman stepped fully into the kitchen. For half a second, no one moved. Lila's expression shifted fast. Too fast. Her smile came back like a light switch. "Oh, hey, Daniel." "Just grabbing something cold." Her voice was bright, careful. Daniel met her gaze evenly. "Yeah." He adjusted his grip on the bottle, casual, controlled. "Thought I would cool down a bit." The second woman avoided eye contact entirely, suddenly very interested in the bowl of chips on the counter. Lila studied Daniel's face for a reaction. For tension, for offense, for anything she could read. Daniel gave her none. Instead, he lifted the bottle slightly in a polite gesture. "Party's going well." His tone was smooth, neutral. Lila's smile held, but something behind her eyes tightened almost invisibly. "Glad you think so." Daniel nodded once. Then he stepped past them and headed back toward the patio door. Each step measured. Unhurried. But as the evening noise grew louder again through the open doorway, something inside his chest had shifted position. Not broken, not exposed, just awake. And Daniel Mercer had learned the hard way that once that feeling surfaced, it rarely went back to sleep on its own. The noise hit Daniel Mercer the second he stepped back outside. Laughter, music, the sharp hiss of soda cans opening. It all rushed back in like the house had briefly muted the world, and now someone had turned the volume too high. He paused just past the patio door, letting his eyes adjust to the shifting evening light. The sky over Alder Ridge Drive had deepened into that soft blue that comes right before full dark. Porch lights were flicking on one by one along the street. From a distance, the block party still looked easy, still looked welcoming. Up close, Daniel noticed the small gaps, the way conversations paused half a beat when he passed too near. The way people smiled quickly, then looked away first. Nothing obvious. Nothing anyone could point to. But it was there. He took a slow sip of the beer. The cold finally cut through the lingering heat in his chest. For a second, he let himself focus on the simple things. The condensation on the glass. The faint bitterness on his tongue. The steady rhythm of the music. Normal. He could do normal. Near the grill, Mark Holloway, the tall man from 2 houses down, waved him over with a broad, easy grin. Mark wore a faded baseball cap and an apron that read King of the Grill in peeling red letters. "Daniel, come here, man. You tried the burgers yet?" The tone was friendly, loud enough for others to hear. Daniel walked over, careful to keep his posture loose. Not too stiff, not too eager. Working on it. Mark laughed and flipped a burger with more force than necessary. Grease popped loudly against the metal grate. "You better hurry. Kids already went through the first batch like a pack of wolves." 2 men beside Mark chuckled. One of them, a stocky guy Daniel vaguely recognized from earlier introductions, gave him a quick nod that didn't quite become a smile. Daniel reached for a paper plate from the stack. "Appreciate you cooking for the whole street." Mark puffed slightly at that. "Hey, somebody's got to keep this place running." For a few minutes, the conversation stayed easy. Safe topics, weather, traffic near the highway, the never-ending construction on the west side of town. Daniel responded where appropriate, nodded when expected, smiled at the right beats. On the surface, he blended in, but the feeling from the kitchen had not left him. It sat quietly under his ribs, waiting. Across the yard, Lila reappeared near the drink table. She was laughing at something a neighbor said, her posture relaxed, but Daniel noticed the quick glance she sent in his direction. Fast, assessing. Gone a second later. His stomach tightened slightly. Mark handed him a freshly grilled burger wrapped in foil. "Careful, it's hot." Daniel accepted it with a small nod. "Thanks." He stepped a few feet away from the grill before unwrapping it. Steam curled up into the cooling night air. The smell was good, familiar, comforting in a way he had not expected. He took a bite. Juice and grease hit his tongue at once. For a moment, his shoulders lowered a fraction. Then 2 women passed behind him on their way toward the sidewalk. Their voices were low, but not low enough, just saying, "People don't usually land here that fast." The rest blurred under the music. Daniel kept chewing. Slow, even. He did not turn his head, did not react, but the burger suddenly tasted heavier in his mouth. A kid's basketball rolled across the grass and bumped lightly against Daniel's shoe. He looked down automatically. A boy, maybe 10 years old, stood several feet away watching him. Waiting. Daniel bent and picked up the ball. "You lose this." The kid nodded quickly, but did not step closer right away. His eyes flicked briefly toward the group of adults near the patio. Then back to Daniel. Daniel offered the ball out. "You're good." "Go ahead." The boy took it and jogged off without another word. Small moment. But it left a faint hollow feeling behind. Daniel straightened slowly. Across the yard, conversations were still flowing. Music still pulsing. Lanterns still glowing warm against the darkening sky. From the outside, the night looked successful, friendly, easy. Daniel took another slow bite of the burger, then another. He forced himself to stay present. Stay calm, stay patient. Because one thing years of careful living had taught him was this: people rarely showed you what they really thought in the first 30 minutes. The truth always leaked out later, usually when they thought you were not listening, usually when they felt comfortable enough to stop performing. Daniel swallowed the last bite and wiped his hands carefully on a napkin. Across the yard, Lila was watching him again. This time, she did not look away fast enough. And for the first time that night, Daniel felt something sharper than discomfort press quietly into his chest. Not anger, not yet. Just the slow, steady certainty that this neighborhood was still deciding what to do with him, and the decision was not finished. By the time the sun dropped fully behind the rooftops, the block party had shifted. The early evening energy had softened into something looser. Music still played, but lower now. Conversations broke into smaller circles. A few families had already started packing up folding chairs. From a distance, Alder Ridge Drive looked comfortable. Up close, Daniel Mercer could feel the hairline tension running underneath it. He stood near the edge of the yard, beer bottle half empty in his hand, watching the slow rhythm of neighbors moving around one another. He kept his posture relaxed, shoulders loose, expression neutral. He had learned long ago that people watched more closely when you looked like you were watching back. So he didn't. Instead, he focused on small things. The way the citronella candles flickered unevenly in the breeze, the sticky feeling of dried lemonade still clinging faintly to his palm, the quiet hum of conversation drifting between the houses. Normal? Keep it normal. Mark Holloway approached again, wiping his hands on a dish towel that had long since given up being clean. His earlier confidence had softened slightly, replaced by the loose friendliness of someone who'd been standing near the cooler too often. "You settling in okay so far?" The question sounded casual, but Mark's eyes lingered just a second too long. Daniel took a measured sip of his beer before answering. "Yeah, still unpacking boxes, but it's coming together." Mark nodded slowly. "Good, good." He shifted his weight, glancing briefly toward the cluster of neighbors near the driveway before leaning in just slightly closer to Daniel. Not in a threatening way. More like someone lowering their voice without fully committing to it. Quiet street, this one. Daniel felt the words before he fully processed them. He kept his tone even. "That's what I was hoping for." Mark gave a short chuckle, but it did not fully land. Yeah, folks around here just like to know who's around. You get me. There it was, soft, polite, wrapped in neighborly concern. Daniel's grip on the bottle tightened almost invisibly. He nodded once. Makes sense. Mark studied his face for a beat longer, as if waiting for something more. When it didn't come, he straightened and clapped Daniel lightly on the shoulder. Well, you seem like a solid guy. Another compliment, another sentence that sounded warmer than it felt. Daniel gave a small smile. Appreciate that. Mark lingered half a second longer, then drifted back toward the grill, already calling out to someone else. Daniel remained where he was, still. Measured. But inside, something had shifted another notch. Across the yard, Lila was gathering empty cups from one of the folding tables. Her movements were efficient, practiced, but every so often her gaze flicked towards Daniel. Not openly, quick, checking. A group of neighbors near the sidewalk lowered their voices as he passed within earshot. Not enough to hide it, just enough to make it noticeable. Daniel kept walking, step by step, slow, controlled. He moved toward the drink table again, mostly to give his hands something to do. The ice in the cooler had melted further now, bottles floating in cloudy water. As he reached down to grab another drink, laughter burst suddenly behind him. Sharp, too sharp. Daniel turned slightly before he could stop himself. Near the driveway, a man he had only briefly met earlier was telling a story to a small circle of neighbors. Something about break-ins a few streets over. The word security carried clearly across the yard. For half a second, the man's eyes flicked toward Daniel, then quickly away. The group's laughter faded just a little too fast. Daniel felt it land. Not proof, not direct, but enough. He straightened slowly, the cold bottle in his hand no longer grounding the way it had earlier. The night air felt different now, heavier, more deliberate. Across the yard, Lila caught his eye again. This time, her smile came a fraction too late, and in that tiny delay, Daniel Mercer finally understood something he'd been trying not to name all evening. They were still deciding what kind of neighbor he was, and somewhere along the way tonight, the conversation about him had already started. The night thinned slowly. By 9:30, the block party had started its quiet unwind. The music was lower now, switching from bass-heavy pop to something softer and older. A few families were already loading coolers into trunks. Folding chairs scraped against pavement. From the outside, it looked like a successful neighborhood night. Daniel Mercer stood near the drink table, watching the small departures begin. He had learned something important over the years. People showed their first face early. Their real one came out when they started getting comfortable. Mark Holloway was firmly in the comfortable stage. Daniel spotted him near the driveway, deep in conversation with 3 other men. Mark's voice carried easily across the yard, helped by the loose confidence of someone 2 beers past careful. "Yeah, no, I'm serious. Couple streets over, middle of the afternoon." One of the men whistled low. "No kidding. That close?" Mark nodded, wiping his hands on his jeans even though they were already clean. "That's why folks around here keep an eye on things. Quiet neighborhood doesn't stay quiet by accident." The words drifted across the grass. Casual. Harmless on the surface, Daniel kept his gaze on the cooler in front of him, but his ears sharpened without effort. Another man asked, voice lower, "Police ever figure out who it was?" Mark shrugged. "Nah, probably someone passing through. You know how it goes." A small pause followed. Then Mark added, tone lighter but edged just enough to catch attention. Or someone new in the area. The group gave a soft round of knowing chuckles. Not loud enough to call out, not quiet enough to miss. Daniel's fingers went still on the neck of his bottle. There it is. Not an accusation. Not even a direct suggestion. Just a story placed carefully into the air, the kind that let people draw their own conclusions. Daniel forced his shoulders to stay loose, forced his breathing to remain even. Do not react too early. That rule had saved him more than once in the past. Across the yard, Lila was stacking plastic cups into a trash bag. Her posture was relaxed, but her attention kept drifting toward the group by the driveway, toward Mark, toward the men listening. Daniel followed her line of sight. The conversation was still going. One of the men leaned closer. "You think we got anything to worry about?" Mark lifted one shoulder. "Hard to say. Like I said, just smart to stay aware, smart to stay aware." Daniel felt something hot flicker briefly in his chest. Not full anger, not yet. But the familiar warning heat was there now, steady and building. He took a slow drink from the bottle, bitter, cold, grounding. Behind him, footsteps approached across the patio. Lila's voice came gently at his side. "You doing okay over here?" Daniel turned. Her smile was soft, concerned in a way that almost looked genuine. Almost. He nodded once. "Yeah, just getting some air." Her eyes studied his face carefully, searching. "You've been pretty quiet tonight." There was no accusation in her tone, just observation. Daniel let a small breath leave his nose. Still learning everyone's names, that earned a light laugh from her, fair enough. We can be a lot all at once. She shifted the trash bag in her hand, but she didn't leave right away. Instead, she lowered her voice slightly. "Hope nobody's making you feel out of place." The sentence was gentle, careful. Daniel held her gaze for a beat longer than before, just getting the lay of the land. Her smile flickered. Quick, controlled. "Well, for what it's worth, people around here notice consistency, that's all." Consistency. Another soft word. Another quiet measurement. Daniel nodded slowly. Good to know. For a moment, neither of them moved. The music drifted softer through the night air. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. Lila finally gave him one last polite smile. "You'll settle in fine, I'm sure of it." Then she turned and walked back toward the folding tables, already calling out to someone about leftover desserts. Daniel remained where he was, still, watching the easy rhythm of neighbors who had known each other for years. Behind the friendly faces, behind the careful words. A story about him had already started forming. Not spoken outright, not written down, but moving quietly from person to person all the same. Daniel lifted the bottle again, but did not drink. Because something deep in his chest had finally stopped pretending tonight was just another friendly welcome. They were watching him, measuring him. And sooner or later, someone here was going to decide what they thought he really was. The only question left now was whether Daniel Mercer was going to stay quiet long enough to hear the full truth, or if they were about to learn they had started the wrong story. By the time the first families started leaving, the air had cooled enough to raise a light chill across Daniel Mercer's forearms. The lanterns still glowed above Alder Ridge Drive, but the party had lost its earlier brightness. Conversations were smaller now. Voices lower. The easy laughter from before came in shorter bursts. End-of-the-night energy. Daniel stood near the edge of the yard, bottle nearly empty, watching the slow unravel of the evening. This was usually when people relaxed their guard, or let it slip. Across the driveway, Mark Holloway had settled into a folding chair with two other men. Their voices drifted in uneven waves, softened by distance and the low music still playing near the grill. Daniel was not trying to listen, but years of practice had tuned his attention anyway. Not saying anything's wrong, just, you know. Mark's voice carried in fragments. One of the other men gave a low hum of agreement. Another said something too quiet to catch. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Same rhythm, same careful language. Nothing direct, everything implied. A cooler lid slammed somewhere behind him. He turned briefly. Lila was near the drink table again, tying off another trash bag. Her movements were efficient, but tonight Daniel noticed something he had missed earlier. Every few minutes her gaze drifted back to him, not openly staring, but checking, like she was keeping track. Their eyes met for half a second. This time, she did not look away immediately. Instead, she offered that same polished neighborhood smile, warm, controlled. Daniel gave a small nod in return. Inside, the tight feeling under his ribs pressed a little deeper. Near the sidewalk, a couple Daniel had been introduced to earlier walked past him toward their car. The husband gave him a polite half-wave. "Good seeing you tonight." Friendly words. But the wife's eyes lingered on Daniel just a beat too long before she followed her husband down the driveway. There it was again. That pause. That quiet mental note people made when they thought you would not notice. Daniel took a slow breath through his nose. Stay patient. Do not move too fast. He set the empty bottle down on the edge of the folding table and rubbed his thumb briefly over the faint, sticky patch still clinging to his palm from earlier lemonade. The small physical sensation grounded him. Across the yard, the conversation near Mark's chair shifted tone. One of the men leaned forward, voice low but sharper now. "You run background on the place when you sold it." Mark gave a short laugh. "Nah, but I know the realtor. She usually flags anything weird." Another pause. Then the first man again. "Still, guy moves in fast like that. Cash deal too, right?" Daniel's chest went very still. "So," they were talking numbers now. Mark shifted in his chair. Daniel could hear the creak of the metal even from across the lawn. "Yeah, that's what I heard. Not loud, but not exactly private either." Daniel's pulse ticked once, hard, behind his ribs. He kept his face neutral, kept his posture loose. But something cold had started threading through the earlier heat in his chest. This was moving. Not aggressive, not confrontational, but moving. Lila appeared beside him again, quieter this time. "You heading out soon?" Her tone was softer than before, less performance in it. Daniel turned slightly toward her. "Probably." She studied his face carefully, like she was trying to decide something. "You've been very calm tonight." There was no accusation in the words, just observation. Daniel let out a slow breath. "Block parties aren't exactly my natural habitat." That earned a small, genuine-sounding laugh from her. Fair enough. But she did not step away. Instead, her voice lowered just slightly. "People around here, they notice patterns. That's all I'll say. Patterns." Not the first time that word had circled him tonight. Daniel held her gaze evenly. "I'll keep that in mind." For a moment, something unreadable flickered behind Lila's eyes. Not unkind, but not fully welcoming either. Then she gave a short nod and stepped back toward the folding tables. The music shifted to a slower song. A car engine started down the street. And Daniel Mercer stood very still in the middle of Alder Ridge Drive, feeling the quiet shape of the night finally settle into place. They were not just curious anymore. They were building a picture, piece by piece. And for the first time since he moved in 3 weeks ago, Daniel began to wonder how long he should let them keep guessing before the truth came out on his terms. By 10:15, the block party was officially thinning. Coolers snapped shut. Folding chairs disappeared into trunks. Someone finally turned the music low enough that the night insects could be heard again along the edge of Alder Ridge Drive. Daniel Mercer stood near the curb now, hands loose at his sides, watching the careful choreography of neighbors winding down. From a distance, it looked routine. Up close, the watching had not stopped. It had only gotten quieter. Mark Holloway rose from his folding chair and stretched his back with a soft groan. His earlier looseness had settled into the slow, steady movements of someone mentally checking off the night. He spotted Daniel near the curb and lifted a casual hand. Heading out. Daniel nodded once. Yeah, early morning tomorrow. That part was true. Mark ambled closer, hands tucked loosely into his pockets. Up close, his expression was still friendly, but there was something else under it now. Curiosity that had not been satisfied. Well, glad you came by tonight. Daniel held his gaze evenly. Appreciate the invite. Mark rocked once on his heels, then spoke in that same careful neighbor tone Daniel had been hearing all evening. You know, folks around here, we just like to keep things predictable. There it was again, different wording. Same message. Daniel let the silence sit for half a second before answering. Predictable's not a bad thing. Mark studied his face, clearly weighing something. Then he gave a short nod. No, it's not. But he did not move away right away. Instead, his voice lowered just a notch. Long as everyone's on the same page, the words were soft, almost polite. Daniel felt the familiar pressure build slowly in his chest. He could keep smiling, keep nodding, keep letting them write their quiet little story about him. Or he could start choosing when the narrative shifted. Not tonight, not yet. But soon. Daniel gave Mark a small, easy smile. I get that. For a brief second, Mark's expression flickered. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction. Something in between. Then he clapped Daniel lightly on the shoulder and stepped back toward the driveway, already calling out to someone else about leftover burgers. The moment passed, but the weight of it stayed. Daniel turned toward the street. A few houses down, car headlights blinked on one by one. Porch lights cast long yellow stretches across the pavement. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice and fell quiet again. Normal neighborhood sounds. But the feeling in Daniel's chest had settled into something more defined now. This was no longer just polite curiosity. They were watching for confirmation, for patterns, for anything that fit the quiet story already forming in their heads. Behind him, Lila's voice carried faintly as she thanked the last few guests for coming. Her tone was still warm, still practiced. But Daniel noticed one thing. She had not stopped observing him all night. Not once. He reached his car and rested his hand briefly on the cool metal of the door handle. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing, thinking, measuring. Because this part mattered. React too early, and you confirmed their suspicion. Wait too long, and the story hardened without you in the room. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. Timing had always been the difference between control and damage. Behind him, Mark's laughter rose again, softer now as the crowd thinned further. Daniel opened the car door, paused, then glanced once more back toward the cluster of neighbors still gathered under the lantern light. Their conversations continued. Easy on the surface, careful underneath. A slow, steady clarity settled into Daniel Mercer's chest. They thought they were still figuring him out. What they did not realize yet was this. He had already started figuring them out too. And when the moment came to shift the story, he intended to do it where everyone could hear it. Daniel Mercer woke before his alarm. 6:12 a.m. The bedroom was still half dark. Thin gray light pressing through the blinds and narrow stripes across the wall. For a few seconds, he lay still, listening to the quiet hum of the house settling around him. New house sounds still felt unfamiliar. Different pipes, different floor creaks, different silence. Then the memory of the block party returned all at once. Lila's careful smile. Mark's measured tone. The way conversations kept dipping when he passed too close. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose and pushed himself upright. Sleep had not softened any of it. If anything, the pattern looked clearer in the morning. He swung his legs off the bed and sat there for a moment, elbows on his knees, palms loosely hanging between them. The faint stickiness from last night's lemonade still lingered in the small cracks of his skin, despite washing his hands twice before bed. Funny what the body remembered. In the kitchen, the coffee maker clicked to life with a sharp plastic snap. Daniel leaned against the counter while it brewed, staring out through the back window. Alder Ridge Drive looked harmless in daylight. Trimmed lawns, parked SUVs, a jogger passing slowly at the far end of the street. If someone had only seen this version, they would have called it peaceful. Daniel knew better than to trust first impressions. His phone buzzed once against the counter. A new email. He glanced down automatically. Neighborhood Watch. Update. He did not remember signing up for that. Daniel's thumb hovered over the screen for half a second before he opened it. Short message, friendly tone, general reminder about recent activity in nearby areas. Encouragement to report anything unusual, standard community language, except for one small line near the bottom. Welcome to Alder Ridge Drive, Daniel. The coffee machine finished with a hollow gurgle. Daniel stared at the screen a moment longer than necessary. So, they had already added him to the list. Efficient. He set the phone down carefully and poured the coffee. The smell rose strong and bitter, grounding in a way he needed more than he wanted to admit. Across the street, a garage door rolled open with a mechanical whine. Daniel looked up just in time to see Mark Holloway step out, travel mug in hand, dressed for work. Mark spotted him through the window almost immediately. Too quickly. Their eyes met across the quiet morning street. Mark lifted his mug in an easy neighbor wave. Daniel returned the gesture, calm, measured, normal. Mark held the look for just a fraction too long before turning toward his truck. There it is again, that extra second. Daniel took a slow sip of coffee, hot enough to bite the back of his tongue. Good. He needed something sharp this morning. His phone buzzed again. Another notification. This time from the neighborhood group thread. Several new messages overnight. Daniel opened it. Light chatter at first. Thanks for hosting. Great turnout. Loved the burgers. Then, further down, the tone shifted slightly. Anyone else notice the unfamiliar car parked late on Alder last night? Another reply. Probably nothing but worth keeping an eye out. Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly. He scrolled further. One final message sat near the bottom. We should all stay aware, just until we know everyone better. No name attached. For the timing was not subtle, Daniel locked the screen and set the phone face down on the counter. For a long moment, he stood there in the quiet kitchen, coffee warming his hands. Not angry. Not yet. But the shape of things was settling into place faster than they probably realized. They were not accusing him. Not directly. They were doing something quieter, something more careful. They were building permission to doubt him, piece by piece. Across the street, Marks's truck engine started with a low rumble. Daniel watched through the window as it backed slowly out of the driveway. Normal morning. Normal neighborhood. Normal routines. But something inside Daniel Mercer had shifted during the night. The patient part of him was still in control, still calm, still waiting. But underneath that calm, the first real decision had begun to form. Because sooner or later, someone on this street was going to push their quiet little suspicions just a step too far. And when that moment came, Daniel was no longer sure he planned to stay quiet about it. By mid-morning, Alder Ridge Drive had settled back into its weekday rhythm. Garage doors closed. Mail trucks rolled slowly from house to house. Lawns sat quiet under the pale sun like nothing unusual had happened the night before. Daniel Mercer stood at his kitchen sink, rinsing his coffee mug longer than necessary, not because it needed it, because his mind was still running. The neighborhood watch email, the group chat messages, Mark's extra second of eye contact across the street. Individually, none of it meant much. Together, it was starting to form a pattern Daniel knew too well. He dried the mug and set it carefully into the cabinet. Then he made a decision. Small, measured, intentional. If they were watching him, he was going to give them something ordinary to watch. Not defensive, not distant, predictable. Daniel grabbed his keys from the counter and stepped outside. The late morning air was already warming up, carrying the faint smell of fresh-cut grass from somewhere down the block. 2 houses over, a sprinkler ticked back and forth in slow, steady arcs. Normal neighborhood sounds. He walked down the short path to his mailbox. Inside sat the usual stack of early week mail. Utility flyer, grocery coupons. 1 thick envelope from the county office. Daniel flipped through them casually. Across the street, a front door opened. He did not look up immediately. No sudden movements, no sharp reactions. Just another man checking his mail. Finally, he glanced up. Mrs. Holloway stood halfway down her driveway, holding a small watering can. Up close in daylight, she looked softer than she had the night before. Less polished than Lila, more openly curious. Their eyes met. She gave a small, polite smile. Morning. Daniel nodded once. Morning. For a second, neither of them moved. Then she stepped a little closer toward the edge of her lawn, still holding the watering can loosely at her side. Getting settled in okay? The question was casual, but her eyes were studying him carefully. Daniel kept his tone even, still finding where everything goes. That earned a short, understanding nod from her. Houses always feel like that at first. She hesitated, just briefly, then added, neighborhood's usually pretty quiet. There it was again. Quiet. Predictable, aware. Daniel slid the mail under his arm. That's what I was hoping for. Mrs. Holloway's smile flickered, not unfriendly, but not fully relaxed either. Well, folks around here just look out for each other, that's all. Daniel met her gaze steadily. Sounds like a good system. For a moment, something in her posture softened. Not fully, but enough to notice. She gave one last small nod. You have a good day now. You too. She turned back towards her house, watering can swinging lightly at her side. Daniel remained by the mailbox for another few seconds, breathing slow, measured. That had been the first real test. Polite, controlled, and telling. They were not hostile, not openly suspicious, but they were definitely paying attention. Daniel walked back toward his front door. As he reached the steps, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. Another message from the neighborhood group. Short this time, friendly on the surface. Good to see new neighbors getting involved. No name attached, but the timing was precise enough to feel intentional. Daniel stared at the screen for a long second, then slowly slipped the phone back into his pocket. Inside his chest, the calm was still there, still steady, still patient. But beneath it, the quiet calculation had begun in earnest now. They were testing the edges of who they thought he was, watching for confirmation, waiting for something that made their quiet little doubts feel justified. Daniel opened his front door and stepped inside. The house closed softly behind him, and for the first time since moving onto Alder Ridge Drive, he began to consider exactly how long he was willing to let them keep guessing wrong. Late afternoon settled slowly over Alder Ridge Drive. By 4:30 p.m., the sun had shifted just enough to throw long shadows across Daniel Mercer's front lawn. The quiet from the morning had held steady all day. No knocks on the door, no unexpected visits. Too quiet, almost. Daniel sat at his small dining table, laptop open but untouched. A stack of unopened moving boxes still lined neatly against the far wall. He had meant to unpack today. Instead, he had been thinking, watching, measuring. Outside, a car door slammed somewhere down the block. Voices drifted faintly through the open window. Normal neighborhood noise. Then his phone buzzed. Once, sharp against the wood table. Daniel glanced down. Private message. From Mark Holloway. The timing alone was enough to make something tighten low in his chest. He opened it. "Hey, man, quick thing. You got a minute later?" Casual, friendly, but not random. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, so it was starting. He did not answer right away. Instead, he stood and moved toward the front window, parting the blinds just enough to see across the street. Mark's truck was back in the driveway. Driver's door still open. Engine ticking softly as it cooled. Mark himself stood near the garage, phone still in hand, looking down at the screen like he was waiting. Not subtle. Daniel let the blinds fall closed again. Slow, controlled. Then he typed back. "Sure, what's up?" The reply came almost immediately. "Mind if I swing by for a quick chat?" There it was. Polite wording. Direct intention. Daniel's jaw flexed once. This was the first real move. Not public, not confrontational, but deliberate. He typed carefully. "Yeah, come on over." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Through the front window, Daniel heard the faint crunch of footsteps crossing the street. Right on schedule. He moved calmly to the kitchen counter and poured himself a glass of water. Not because he was thirsty, because routine mattered. Normal mattered. The doorbell rang. Once, short. Daniel waited 2 seconds before opening the door. Mark stood on the porch, hands loose at his sides, expression friendly but tighter than the night before. Up close, the easy block party confidence had thinned. "Hey, hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Daniel stepped back slightly, opening the door wider. "You're good. What's going on?" Mark stepped inside but did not sit. He stayed near the entryway, rocking lightly on his heels like someone choosing his words carefully. So, small thing. He rubbed the back of his neck once. Couple neighbors mentioned they've seen some unfamiliar cars around the last few nights. There it was, not an accusation, not even close. But the direction was clear. Daniel kept his face neutral. "Traffic's been heavier on the main road lately." Mark gave a slow nod. "Yeah, could be that." But he did not leave. Instead, his eyes moved briefly around the room, taking in the still packed boxes, the bare walls, the careful order. Then back to Daniel. Folks around here just like to stay ahead of anything unusual." The word unusual hung in the air between them. Daniel took a slow sip of water, met Mark's gaze evenly. Appreciate the heads up. For a moment, neither of them moved. Mark seemed to be waiting, for defensiveness, for irritation, for something that confirmed the quiet narrative building on the street. Daniel gave him none of it. After a few seconds, Mark nodded once. "All right then, just figured I'd mention it." He turned toward the door, already easing back into that practiced neighbor smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood and all." Daniel walked him to the porch. "Thanks for stopping by." Mark stepped down onto the walkway, paused, then glanced back one last time. Quick measuring, before heading across the street toward his truck. Daniel closed the door softly, and for the first time since the block party, the shape of the situation was fully clear. They were no longer just watching. They were starting to probe, carefully, politely, but deliberately. Daniel set the glass down on the counter. Inside his chest, the patience was still there, still steady. But the clock on how long he intended to stay silent had just started ticking louder. The house felt quieter after Mark left. Not peaceful, just aware. Daniel Mercer stood near the kitchen counter for a full minute after the front door closed, listening to the faint retreat of Mark Holloway's footsteps across the street. The man had been careful, polite, exactly measured. Which meant this was no longer casual neighborhood curiosity, this was organized attention. Daniel picked up his glass again but did not drink. The water inside had already warmed slightly in his hand. Across the room, the stack of unopened boxes sat in clean, deliberate rows. Anyone walking in would see the same thing Mark had seen. New move, minimal furniture. Nothing out of place. Daniel exhaled slowly. They were looking for something. The question now was how far they were willing to push to find it. His phone buzzed again on the counter. Not the neighborhood thread this time. A direct text from an unknown number. Daniel stared at it for half a second before opening the message. "Hi, Daniel. This is Lila from down the street. Hope Mark didn't catch you at a bad time earlier." So, they were coordinating. His jaw tightened once, then relaxed. He typed back, "All good. What's up?" The reply came quickly. "Just wanted to check that everything's settling in okay. We try to keep things smooth around here." Daniel read the sentence twice. Smooth. Another soft word that carried more weight than it appeared. He set the phone down without answering right away. Outside, a delivery truck rolled slowly past the house, brakes hissing softly. The driver glanced briefly toward Daniel's driveway before continuing down the block. Another small look. Another mental note. Daniel finally typed back, "Appreciate that. Still getting things unpacked." 3 dots appeared. Paused. Then her reply. "Let me know if you need anything. People here notice when someone's out of rhythm. Out of rhythm." Daniel's thumb hovered over the screen. There it was. Not hidden anymore, still polite. Still wrapped in neighborly language, but clearer than before. He locked the phone without responding. Enough for now. Across the street, Mark's garage door rumbled open again. Daniel moved toward the front window just enough to see without being obvious. Mark stepped out carrying a small toolbox. Routine, normal. Except halfway down the driveway, Mark paused and looked briefly toward Daniel's house. Not long, but long enough. Daniel let the curtain fall back into place. Inside his chest, the slow heat had started to mix with something colder. Calculation. Because this was no longer just about being welcomed or not. They were testing him in layers. Watching how he moved, how he responded, how much pressure it took to make him slip. Daniel walked slowly back to the dining table and opened his laptop. The screen lit his face in the quiet room. For a moment, he just stared at the reflection of himself in the dark edge of the display. Calm expression, steady posture. Exactly what they expected to see. Exactly what they were waiting to crack. His fingers finally began to move across the keyboard. Not reacting, not yet, but preparing. Because the longer this pattern continued, the more predictable the next move would become. Outside, the late afternoon light shifted again, stretching longer shadows across Alder Ridge Drive. Normal neighborhood. Quiet street. Watchful neighbors. Daniel Mercer leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes steady on the screen. They thought they were slowly closing in on whatever they believed he was hiding. What they had not realized yet was something far more dangerous. He had already started mapping them back. 3 days passed before the street made its next move. Daniel Mercer noticed the pattern long before anyone spoke it out loud. The extra cars idling slower past his driveway. The neighborhood thread growing more active after dark. The subtle but steady increase in porch lights flicking on whenever he stepped outside. They were not panicking. They were organizing, which meant the next step would not be accidental. It came on Thursday evening. At 6:43 p.m., Daniel's phone buzzed with a neighborhood group notification. "Block check tonight. Just making sure everything stays smooth." No name attached. But the timing was precise, and the message had enough casual wording to sound harmless to anyone not paying attention. Daniel set the phone down slowly. So, this was the moment. Outside, Alder Ridge Drive was already shifting into its evening routine. Garage doors closing. Families heading inside. the soft rhythm of suburban normal settling into place. Except tonight, the normal felt staged. Daniel moved calmly through his house. No rush, no sudden movements. He changed into a clean dark jacket, straightened the collar once, then stepped outside just as the first knock came at his door. Right on time, he opened it. Mark Holloway stood on the porch. Lila just behind him. 2 more neighbors further back near the walkway. Not aggressive, not confrontational, but very intentional. Mark gave a polite smile. "Hey, Daniel. Sorry to drop by like this." Daniel leaned lightly against the doorframe. Even tone. "What's going on?" Mark shifted his weight once. "Just doing a quick neighborhood check, couple reports of unfamiliar activity lately. Thought we'd touch base with everyone." Everyone. Daniel's eyes moved briefly past Mark. 3 houses down, another small cluster of neighbors stood in quiet conversation near the sidewalk. Watching. Waiting. He looked back at Mark. Makes sense. Lila studied his face carefully. "You don't mind, right?" There was the test, soft, smiling, carefully placed. Daniel stepped back from the doorway. "Come on in." The small group exchanged quick glances. They had not expected that. Mark entered first, slower now. Lila followed. The other 2 remained near the porch but leaned slightly closer. Inside, the house was exactly as they had seen before. Orderly. Clean. Half-unpacked boxes stacked with precise care. Nothing suspicious, nothing out of place. Mark walked a slow half-circle through the living room, not quite searching, but definitely observing. "You settling in okay so far?" Daniel folded his arms loosely. "Getting there." Silence stretched for a few seconds. Then Lila spoke, voice still smooth. "You understand why folks get cautious. Quiet neighborhoods stay that way because people pay attention." Daniel met her gaze. "I understand patterns very well." Something in his tone shifted just enough to register. Mark glanced at him. First real flicker of uncertainty all night. Daniel let the silence breathe 1 second longer. Then he moved toward the dining table and turned the laptop around. Screen already awake, already prepared. Mark frowned slightly. "What's that?" Daniel's voice stayed calm. "You mentioned unfamiliar activity." The room went very still. On the screen, a clean timeline of security footage thumbnails filled the display. Dates, times, license plates, clear as daylight. Daniel tapped the trackpad once. Footage expanded. Multiple vehicles slowing in front of his house. Different nights, different angles, all documented. Lila's breath caught softly. Daniel continued, steady. Figured since everyone's keeping an eye on things, I should too. Mark's posture changed almost imperceptibly. Defensive now, not confident. Daniel tapped again. Another screen opened. Neighborhood watch logs, public records, time stamped, every extra patrol, every flagged note, every quiet check-in, all visible, all traceable. The silence in the room thickened. For the first time since the block party, no one was smiling. Daniel finally leaned back slightly, voice calm, measured. "I moved here for quiet." Same as everyone else. He let the words settle, then added softer. "But quiet works both ways. No accusation, no raised voice, just clarity." Mark swallowed once. Slow. Lila's polished composure had slipped just a fraction, enough to see Daniel close the laptop halfway but did not shut it. The message was already delivered. After a long moment, Mark cleared his throat. "Well, looks like you've got things handled. Careful retreat." Daniel gave a small nod. "Always do." The group lingered another awkward second before backing toward the door. Polite again, but no longer confident. No longer leading the narrative. When the door finally closed behind them, the house returned to silence. Outside, the quiet rhythm of Alder Ridge Drive resumed. Porch lights, distant traffic, normal suburban calm. Daniel stood still for a moment in the center of the room. breathing slow, even, not triumphant, not angry, just finished. Across the street, Mark's porch light clicked off, and for the first time since moving onto Alder Ridge Drive, the watching stopped, at least for now. End of story. If you want, I can next generate the strongest CTR title options and 3-line thumbnail text that fits your final text formula. If this story hit a little too close to home, you are not alone. Situations like this happen more often than people admit. If you believe quiet strength matters more than loud assumptions, take a second to support the channel. Tap subscribe so you do not miss the next story. Leave a comment and tell us honestly. When a neighborhood starts watching you too closely, do you stay patient? Or do you speak up early? Your voice shapes what we tell next.